Bitcoin's blockchain isn't unique because it's a blockchain. It's unique because of the properties and the game theory and the distributed nature of the nodes and just so many different things that make it really effective at doing its one singular kind of difficult job, which is preventing double spending and the modest hope of becoming money that is not connected to the state.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Blockware Intelligence Podcast. This week I have on Bryan Jacoutot. Bryan, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Joe. It's a thrill for me to be on the Blockware Podcast. Very exciting.
Awesome. Yeah, glad to have you. You know, you're a fellow Atlanta guy like myself, so it's good to have some more people from Georgia on the podcast. But I want to ask, the audience may not know who you are. Who are you and how did you originally get into Bitcoin?
So, I'm pretty much your standard Bitcoin pleb, so to speak. I got into Bitcoin as really kind of a hobby. My profession is I'm a lawyer, particularly an election litigator. That's what I do for the most part now. I've worked in a couple different areas of law over the course of my career, but I'm essentially devoted mostly to election litigation. I have developed a small Bitcoin-related legal practice within my firm as well. That's probably 90-10, so to speak, on that. And the reason why that practice even developed was because I just got into Bitcoin, I started out in crypto as a hobby. Particularly, actually, was focused on Ethereum from the legal mindset, thinking that smart contracts were going to be everything. I bought into a lot of early marketing, so to speak, with the Ethereum the industry and the similar coins that are out there like that back in late 2016, early 2017. But as I was trying to explain to my colleagues how this Ethereum ecosystem is going to change the world, I had to go from first principles. And so to do that, I got into Bitcoin. I started learning how Bitcoin worked, and I figured from there I could determine how everything else was going to work. And in that deep dive that I did to try to explain to my colleagues how we're going to be obsoleted as a profession in the future and things like that, I learned that there were a lot of limitations on this new technology, this new blockchain technology. And I learned that the biggest thing that it could provide us was really Bitcoin. And that's really the only, in my experience and in my research, that's the only thing that I found that really jumped out to me as a great use case was something like Bitcoin. That's not to say nothing else can work, but in my experience and in my, going down the rabbit hole, so to speak, I saw Bitcoin as really the only value prop that was worth my time and my energy in understanding and learning. And so I kind of started out, I guess, as complete crypto guy and slowly gravitated towards Bitcoin only, and that's really where I am now personally. The legal portion of my practice goes into other areas, but personally, I'm Bitcoin only. It's the only thing I own, and it seems like it's the best use of our time.
Nice. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Can you dive in a little, very high level, but a little bit deeper on what you currently do, as a lawyer? And you mentioned you practice in the elections group. As a non-lawyer, I don't really even know what that even means. So can you dive a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah. So the election law really wasn't even a practice area, I would describe it as, until probably the last 6 or 7 years. And slowly since then, it's become its own thing. I mean, when I talk to other lawyers, they have no idea what the concept of election law is as a practice. So don't feel bad because it's very new. But if you're paying attention to what's going on these days, there's a lot of election law related cases, whether it's challenging the election results or challenging the system generally speaking. So there's a lot of legal need, and those challenges are always based on legal precedent and laws and whether they're local or state or federal. So that's what I do. I handle those for our clients. Typically, I work on the side of the government. I defend the Secretary of State of Georgia and a couple of counties in here. And that gets us into litigation a ton. So when I say litigation, there's a lot of different aspects of legal practice. Some people sit behind a desk, review contracts. Some people negotiate with clients. Other people go into court, and going into court is sort of the litigation aspect of things. So the goal is to sort of take that litigation experience from election law and bring it into the Bitcoin space. And I think, as we've talked about before, happily for Bitcoiners, there's not a great deal of legal problems for Bitcoin, because it's so well envisioned and designed that it avoids a lot of the problems that these countless other cryptocurrencies run into. So it's great for Bitcoiners, which I am one, so it's good on that side. But it's tough for the legal practice because they don't go to court that often. But the goal is essentially to take that litigation experience in election law and knowing the federal courts and everything, and apply it to clients in the Bitcoin space who, if they ever unfortunately get into a situation where they're being sued, probably by Craig Wright, that they've got lawyers to back them up, and that know not only the courtroom but the actual underlying protocol. Because when you're educating, basically lawyers do at the end of the day is attempt to educate judges on whatever issue is before them. And I think that it's incredibly important to have lawyers who understand the underlying protocol, who understand the story of Bitcoin, and can articulate that understanding to the judge so that they can make informed decisions when they're weighing the facts of the case against the current state of the law. And I think that that's a great melding of things that I want to be able to give to the judge. And that's the whole point of the Bitcoin practice group, is be there, have the sort of broad spectrum understanding of Bitcoin, understanding of the courtroom, understanding of litigation generally, and be able to help our clients to the extent that they need it.
Definitely. That kind of gets us into like what we're mainly going to talk about today, which is like there's a big kind of debate in the Bitcoin and quote unquote crypto community about are certain things, securities, and are certain things commodities, including like Bitcoin itself. Like, what is like the definition of like, or what is a security and like what is a commodity? Like what is the difference at a high level?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and I think honestly the what is a security question is probably the biggest legal question in crypto right now. It's certainly the most well known, and happily again for Bitcoin, it's not an issue really, because it's really the only one that's been decided by the powers that be, so to speak. Is not a security, but a security revolves around what we call the Howie test, and that name, I'm sure most people in this space are familiar with it. That name comes from a Supreme Court case from 1946, and in that case, they established what was a security and an investment contract, which would be subject to the jurisdiction of the SEC. And the reason why that's even important in the first place is because when you're subject to the jurisdiction of the SEC, you have to abide by all these regulations. You have to make all these disclosures. And that's just a vestige from when the SEC was created, kind of post-Depression era, when the government decided that freewheeling investment was potentially problematic for the economy because it could result in crashes that we saw during the Depression. So they created the SEC and all these regulatory standards and disclosures. And most cryptocurrencies don't do. I would say the vast majority. I don't really know any that do yet. They don't abide by these regulatory requirements because it's sort of fly by the seat of your pants. And let's create something and see if the public wants it. Which is I love the entrepreneurial spirit, but in the U.S., if you're exposed to the U.S. jurisdiction, it creates problems for you. So the Howie test basically said that an investment contract that is a security that's subject to the SEC's jurisdiction is something that is an investment of money. And when they say money, they mean really anything of value. It doesn't have to be money. So Bitcoin can be an investment of money. But you have an investment of money with an expectation of profit from that investment. And that investment of money is in a common enterprise, meaning there's a company or a group of individuals who are all working towards the same end that's identifiable. And then that profit that you receive comes primarily not from your own efforts, but from the efforts of others. And in the financial sense, the financial world, the question is really, is it a security? And if you answer yes to that, then yeah, it's a security. If you answer no to that, then it's probably a commodity.
Very interesting. So I guess with the Howie test being invented, way back when, has there ever been like a debate like this, or at least like this common in legal history, where like there's actually like a debate on whether this asset is a commodity or this asset as a security?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly happens. I'm not sure about necessarily how often it happens. And again, so that your viewers know, I'm a litigator first, securities lawyer. I am not. I work with our securities lawyers in our firm as a consultant on the Bitcoin side of things. So I don't want to say that I have all the information in the security space, but as a result of my consulting with our securities lawyers on the Bitcoin side and crypto side of things, I've done my own research on this for the last several years. And so I'm sort of well aware of a lot of the securities laws, but I would not hold myself out as a securities attorney. That being said, though, there is a lot of times a little give and take between the CFTC, which is the agency involved with regulating commodities, and the SEC, which is the agency involved with regulating securities. And I think I want to say 2015, 2016, they had a bit of a jurisdictional dust up over an indice for an index in the basically it was supposed to be an equities index of dividends, and so they wanted to basically capture the S&P 500's dividends and hold that out as a financial instrument to invest in. And the CFTC said it was effectively a commodity and claimed exclusive jurisdiction over it. SEC said, no, this is a securities future investment, a financial instrument, so we have jurisdiction. And they duked it out for a while, and I think they ended up having a dual jurisdiction, if memory serves. But yeah, so it's not unprecedented what we're seeing here in the crypto space. And I know we often like to think it is because the technology is so new. The technology that powers this, and I don't like to use that term because I think people kind of pay way too much respect to the concept of blockchain, and they think it's just this panacea and this unhackable database. And those of us who are involved in this space know that that's really not true, and that's mostly marketing. But they've got a clever, sort of complex way of packaging these investments. And even though that new, clever, complex way is very interesting and novel, it has precedent in the past, and so you're seeing that play out right now, and that's in large part a lot of what the SEC is doing in these cases that they're bringing against Ripple and other individual investors that they previously brought against the likes of Telegram and things like that, is packaging that 1946 case and applying it to present day. And so far they've been fairly successful when they've pursued these. Ripple's an interesting case to keep your eye on, because a lot of people will settle, including Telegram. But yeah, so it's not unprecedented what we're going through, and this is sort of par for the course for litigation and for regulatory action.
Yeah, I definitely agree that the whole idea of blockchain is like the Bitcoin blockchain is special and unique, but blockchain itself is definitely like a marketing and sales tool that people use to just sell a solution to a problem that doesn't exist, to large companies that may just want to get ahead of the curve or whatnot.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, just to give you an example, like being the Bitcoin guy at my large law firm, I get a lot of different questions from lawyers in the firm that say, "Oh, I've got a client who's thinking about doing this or that," and they mention crypto, and they, like most people, will just associate crypto and Bitcoin as one and the same. They really don't differentiate between them. And like as you and I know, they are different. Bitcoin's blockchain isn't unique because it's a blockchain. It's unique because of the properties and the game theory and the distributed nature of the nodes and just so many different things that make it really effective at doing its one singular kind of difficult job, which is preventing double spending and the modest hope of becoming money that is not connected to the state. But I get questions about putting real estate on a blockchain and voting on a blockchain, and just all sorts of stuff. And I have to kind of sit down and take the wind out of their sail. I mean, I'm probably like the annoying lawyer in the room who's like, let's just pump the brakes on these ideas. And I'm hoping I'm somewhat useful, but I have to sort of tell them that the blockchain is not the equivalent of an unhackable database. So if you let's put aside the difficulty of taking all of the property records in the history of your state and putting them on the blockchain, in some database, and hoping there's no human error, no automation error in starting that off. But if you do that, then what's the point of throwing that on a quote unquote blockchain if all the data is so intensive that only a few nodes could ever actually run it? How is that any different from what we have now, where you have a few county registers offices and things like that maintain the state of the property ledger? And it's often it's either not just as good or way worse, and so that's what people need to be on the lookout for, I think. And I think that's a bit of an aside, but that's sort of the stuff we see with the blockchain in the legal space. Yeah,
I mean, I definitely think there's a lot of flaws when it comes to the idea of putting physical items on a blockchain.
Yeah.
But transitioning back like towards Bitcoin, I guess specifically, we recently saw like the SEC go after Kim Kardashian of all people by fining her, $1.2 million for promoting, I don't even know what tokens she was promoting, but some sort of crypto tokens. And then like a couple days ago, Peter Schiff made a tweet about how the SEC should go after Saylor and others for promoting Bitcoin. So I know you've been working a lot on this, or at least have been thinking a lot about this. Why is Bitcoin specifically not a security and basically a commodity?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, this goes back to that same sort of first principles approach that I took back in the day when I was looking at different cryptocurrencies and deciding on which one I liked. Bitcoin has this very unique origin story that I'm not really convinced could ever be replicated at this point. But there are a number of factors that I've identified, and others as well have identified as the things that separate it apart. And I think they can kind of be distilled down into what we would call a fair launch, which is really the antithesis of what happens now with most cryptocurrencies, where you have either a pre-mine or a pre-allocation of your cryptocurrency and distribute either among privileged individuals or to early investors at a low price. And that's how you kind of get that token out there into the world. Bitcoin's was very much the opposite of that. You had essentially, with the exception of, I guess, the Genesis block, potentially, there were no preordained Bitcoins. And the Genesis block, its reward was the same 50 Bitcoin as every other block thereafter. And we're now on, taking into account the halving. So it was the same reward for the first 210,000 blocks. Satoshi didn't get a privileged allocation. You could argue, I guess, that he knew about it first, and so he was privileged in that manner, but you still had to do the proof of work. You still had to invest the time, the energy, the computing power in order to get that, the same as anybody else. Now, it's great that if you got there early, but that's not what I would call unfair, in that there was a privileged allocation given to certain people. If you joined the network in 2009, and you started mining, then you got the 50 for the work that you produced, and same as anybody else. So that's one aspect I think that was important. The other aspect is the valueless circulation that occurred from that Genesis block till 2009, end of 2009, 2010. It's kind of, I think it's arguable that there were exchanges identifying potential price points for Bitcoin in late 2009. But I think everybody recognizes the Bitcoin pizza transaction in 2010 as the definitive moment where there was a market price set for Bitcoin. But either way, there was a period of months or a year and a half that Bitcoin circulated with no value. And so when you're thinking about that from the perspective, let's kind of think about those first two things from the perspective of a securities regulator. The fair launch, as we talked about earlier, there's those 4 prongs of the Howie test. One of those prongs is there's an investment of money with an expectation of profit from that investment. With a fair launch and valueless circulation, there can be no argument that there was an expectation of profit from that investment. And you weren't obviously buying it, you were using computing power and time and energy to cultivate it. And with there being no price, you were actually doing that at a loss. So it's the exact opposite of what the Howie test looks for. You had people mining Bitcoin at a loss at the beginning, and that stands in direct contrast to all these other cryptocurrencies that come out with a promise of gains. Why do people buy these cryptocurrencies for the most part? Because they want gains, they want moon, they want all that stuff, and that just wasn't the atmosphere at the beginning of the Bitcoin story. Now, obviously, it certainly became that atmosphere later on. But when you're looking towards the launch of the currency and the launch of the project and the protocol, that's a big distinguishing factor. So that's two things. The other thing is particularly in the last decade, there's no leadership team in Bitcoin, and every time you think there's a leader, they are cast down by the community, it seems. But with the exception, I will concede that Satoshi Nakamoto was certainly the founder, but I would not call him the leader in any respect, because it was his effect over the protocol was really only to the extent that his computers had the power to generate, in terms of adding new blocks to the blockchain, and that his ideas had the power to persuade. But he was never, the Vitalik Buterin, or I don't want to say Joe Lubin, but the people who identify as the leaders of the protocol. Satoshi really didn't have that power, and to the extent that he did, if you want to say that he did, sure, that has been gone for well over a decade, and that's pretty remarkable. And I don't think there's anything out there that can replicate that. So when you have no leadership team, there is no common enterprise in which to direct the protocol. And as we've seen, leaders have tried to emerge over the course of Bitcoin's history, whether it's Roger Ver or Mike Hearn or Craig Wright, even lest I say his name and breathe life back into it. Those people have been cast aside by the community, and that's a remarkable aspect of the Bitcoin story. And it just shows again that there is no leader here, that it's a kind of a living organism of users that come in and come out at will as needed, and it's incredible. And it really, from a securities perspective, it really diminishes any potential liability for Bitcoin, because there is no common enterprise, right? So you think about again, let's go back to those tests of the Howie test, those prongs of the Howie test. It constitutes an investment of money. Sure, some people put in some money at some point, but certainly not early on. In fact, they were just throwing in computer power. Expectation of profit from the investment, again, early on, can't really say that there was any expectation. The investment money comes in a common enterprise. The enterprise changes all the time. Bitcoin's enterprise is not even, you couldn't even call it an enterprise. So there is no common enterprise. Leaders come and go. They're cast down. To the extent that they maintain any sort of persuasiveness, they have to usually forced to hard fork off and start their own thing, which goes down its own securities path. So it's again, it's really well insulated. And I think the last thing that's really very important is the genuine decentralization of the Bitcoin network. I don't know about you, but I run a Bitcoin node, just using Umbrel software from a Raspberry Pi I got on Amazon. It's trivial power to use. It's trivial time to understand and learn how to do. But, that makes me an entity that has some degree of control over the network. But I can turn that off whenever I want. I can turn it on whenever I want. I can open up a Lightning channel whenever I want, close it down whenever I want. It's entirely voluntary. And there's tens of thousands of people, probably more, all over the world that do this. And again, this just shows there's no real common enterprise, and there's no control over the network or the protocol or Bitcoin itself. And it's another insulating factor. So that genuine decentralization makes it really, really difficult for even an overzealous regulator in the SEC who just wants to come down on Bitcoin. Like, who are you going to identify as the leader of Bitcoin? Who are you going to come down with? On what group are you going to come down on to serve your subpoenas and say come meet us in Congress and talk about what you're doing in Bitcoin, and to the extent that they don't like it, they can say, well, you need to change it, and you're kind of helpless to change it by yourself.
Yeah, definitely. I think in comparison to alts or other cryptos, like Bitcoin doesn't have like a native staking yield, right? Like the only way to accumulate more Bitcoin or new Bitcoin is from proof of work, like purchasing actual hardware that actually just takes in energy, does a bunch of hashes, and then gets Bitcoin. Like there's no native yield that the developers or the founders like put in to like try to encourage you to buy into this coin, and then you'll actually earn yield or like, quote unquote like dividends, future like forward looking. It's just the only way to get more Bitcoin is to put in work, basically.
Yep, and again, that goes to the fair launch, the fair distribution, the ultimate fairness of the system is all buttressed by that, and it's just another thing that sets it apart from others.
And then another thing is not even just the idea of generating yield, but like fees burning. I know like Ethereum with proof of stake, the idea is, the ultrasound money idea where, hey, if we burn enough fees, the supply, or we have enough fees that we burn, the supply can actually go down. Kind of like it kind of makes sense on paper. Like if you look at shares outstanding for Apple over the last, I don't know, 6+ years, shares outstanding are going straight down. Apple is, ultra deflationary or ultrasound money, I guess, if you want to call it that. But, that's kind of like, Apple is clearly, an equity, and they're trying to get a return for their investors. So it's almost like, is ETH like this native, token that there's a group, the Ethereum Foundation, that's trying to, generate yield or generate a return for their investors? I mean, it's an interesting idea.
It is, and I do think I love the ultrasound money meme. But like we should dispel the fact that a merely temporary deflationary monetary policy does not make you ultrasound money. And that ultrasound money is not really a thing. You either have sound money or you don't. But what the sound money thesis comes from the predictability of the supply issuance, which is what Bitcoin has and what everyone's jealous of that they can never recreate, because we have now this just decades plus long history of supply issuance cut with all the halvings. And so if Ethereum or any other token, they get together with a social consensus mechanism and say, hey, we're gonna cut the supply through token burns, and it's going to be deflationary, that is completely the same as monetary policy as it exists today in the fiat world. There's no distinction there. So when the Fed raises interest rates, that's a deflationary ultrasound money move, right? But I don't think anyone would call the Fed's dollar or any other central bank's currency ultrasound because they periodically throw in some deflationary bug every now and then.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think the M2 like growth percentage year over year right now is technically like negative, or at least like the last 6 months or so. So technically the dollar is ultrasound money right now.
Yes, by the Ethereum standard, yes.
Yeah. Then again, I guess if you asked me a year ago, or you told me a year ago that you should switch to dollars, or you should hold more dollars because it's about to be ultrasound, I probably should have done that.
yeah. It's really tough. You got to time it just right. But if you can do that and you've got the inside track with the insiders, then by all means, please go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Cool.
Just make sure you get out of there in time.
Yeah. Cool. I think that was, good covering of Bitcoin and why it's, I guess, not a security. I'm curious to know, like, as in your law practice, you said you do a few things in the Bitcoin and crypto space. Like, what do you see most often? What are people coming to you and asking you for help on?
Typically, it's just this token launch. Let's get it going. Like, let's start it. I've got an idea. I've got a token I want to launch. Like, let's get it going. And so you kind of have to talk about there's so many different aspects of doing that, because you run into potential FinCEN regulations, you run into securities regulations, you run into Bank Secrecy Act problems and things like that, because all these launches they butt up against all these different alphabet soup agencies in the United States, and obviously I focus United States only. So there's all these other ones in Europe and in other jurisdictions that I don't even really pay attention to because I'm only thinking about the United States. But that's typically what it is. So we have these lawyers who come in that are, banking lawyers, we have securities lawyers, and, I speak with them and just, again, try to get them to understand how this works from a tech perspective. Not being, I wouldn't call myself super technically inclined or anything like that, but I understand how it works, and it's sufficient to sort of give them the ability to run their legal analysis in their discrete area of the law. And so that's really what's been the most part of it. Ideally, what we would have is Bitcoin companies. The original structure of the practice was to have Bitcoin companies coming to us for not necessarily Bitcoin related work, but it would be more like traditional law work, like employment law contracts and corporate structuring and things like that. And to the extent they ever get litigation issues for whatever reason it may be, we can help them out with there, as I was talking about earlier about educating the judge. But again, thankfully that doesn't happen that often. I think exchanges experience probably the most litigation exposure, but I haven't worked personally with any exchanges or anything like that yet. But I do think that they get a good amount of exposure, and we've had clients in the firm that have dealt with that. But that's probably primarily what I would say I do is dealing with these token launches and trying to advise the lawyers who are advising them.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Are there any like regulations or like laws that you think that either currently apply to Bitcoin and crypto or could apply to Bitcoin and crypto that you may think that need to be added or edited or removed in the US?
Let me see. So I think, with Bitcoin, I think less is more. I think trying to get out of the way is really the best option. It's a very, I would say, mature protocol. It's very deliberative in its actions, and one of the largest critiques against it is that it's too slow to change. And crypto is this move fast and break things mindset, which for whatever, better or for worse, that's what it is. A lot of people like that. I think it has its place. But yeah, I mean, Bitcoin, I think that the regulators just need to just stay out of the way as best they can. There's issues with miners, Bitcoin miners, and I think there's this impression that Bitcoin miners approve transactions, which I don't think is really how it works in practice. But there's an impression that they do, and then from that perspective, you might get sort of like that OFAC element where it's financial crimes and terrorism and things like that. So we want to have these blacklisted addresses. And I think that's just the worst possible thing for what purports to be neutral money. And it's so important that we get to a point where Bitcoin is unencumbered by jurisdictions, unencumbered neutral money, because it already is neutral, right? Like that's the way it was designed. We need to ensure that it never gets co-opted by different jurisdictions, because as soon as something happens where something terrible happens, where the person who did the terrible thing, was somewhat, maybe they had a Bitcoin wallet or something and used it to buy a truck that took them to the place where they did something terrible. You're going to get people saying, well, we have to stop this. We have to save, our children, save the babies, blah, blah, blah. No offense. But that's what always happens in these circumstances. And we need to really look at those potential eventualities with a very sober, rational lens. Because if we allow our emotions as a culture, as a country, as a political unit to get the best of us, we're going to really destroy one of Bitcoin's greatest value props. So if miners start saying, oh, I'm only doing OFAC compliant blocks, or I'm only doing this or that, or I'm blocking this address, it really is a slippery slope. And as you've seen, like whether you agree with the Canadian trucker protests or not, I'm sure most Bitcoiners do. But if you're someone who's maybe less inclined to adopt Bitcoin and you like the idea of being able to silence dissent by freezing their accounts, that's really problematic, because protest is one of those fundamental First Amendment things. True, it was in Canada, but it's one of those fundamental things that we think of Western democracy, liberal Enlightenment thought. And if the country that you are a part of is just free to freeze your money, it's not really your money at that point. It's the state's money that they allow you permission to access towards or to use. And that is the thing that Bitcoin is trying to, or one of the things that Bitcoin is trying to get away from. And we have to be very careful to guard that value proposition, because if we lose it, it's a huge loss to Bitcoin. It's a huge loss to humanity and liberty and the ideas of, true liberal values, like a classical liberal values. And I don't want to, get that confused with the political party and everything. But so to answer your question, what can we do from remove from a legal perspective is maintain a strong wall of separation between the state and the neutrality of money. If we can do that, we're really on the right track.
Nice. Yeah, I like it. Yeah, I mean, we saw Marathon, like one of the largest publicly traded miners in the world. They announced it, this was like sometime last year, that they were basically going to follow like the OFAC guidelines of like they can't accept Bitcoin from address, or they weren't going to mine certain blocks from certain addresses that contain UTXOs from those addresses. And then the community definitely was like, hey, don't do that. It's a slippery slope. It's not good for Bitcoin. It's not good for the US. It's not good for the world. And thankfully they stopped that. So yeah, it's interesting that, we've kind of already had like our first battle with, censoring transactions on Bitcoin, and arguably, Bitcoin and the network and the users won.
Yep. Yeah, and we just have to remain vigilant as best we can, and just expect, a lot of the quote FUD and everything coming from the incumbent system, whether it's media, government, or whatever. When you have a tragedy, things get a lot more. We got to do something. And that's where the danger really is. We were able to kind of calmly rationalize with the Marathon situation. Hey, this isn't good. This is part of, we need a neutral layer, and that's great, and that's a great first test, but the test will get harder over time just because of, statistics and the fact that tragedies occur, every so often. And eventually one of those tragedies is going to be linked to Bitcoin, and that's going to be the real challenge, and we really have to be prepared for something like that, both from a lobbying perspective and just from a social cultural perspective, because it's not just going to be, we got to lobby the politicians, we're going to have to convince the public as well of the merits of neutral money. And they're probably not going to want to hear that right away. And it's just, again, it's a challenge. It's one of the biggest challenges, I think, facing Bitcoin, because if we lose that neutrality, we've got a real problem. Happily, the protocol always can be forked, right? So you can always make your bets that neutral money wins out in the end of the day, and you can hang on to your neutral money fork and you'll have your OFAC compliant fork over there. But it's unideal, right? So we want to address those head on, and we want to be able to do that. So preparing now, getting our sort of lobbying foot underneath us and our cultural foot underneath us as well is really, I think, something we need to do over the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, definitely. I think like Andreas Antonopoulos has that like one good quote or that is like a 2-minute video that's on YouTube that he spoke about at a conference. He was like, all right, say like, large governments to get together and create this like OFAC compliant chain where certain transactions are not allowed to get broadcasted. Well, the rest of the chain is going to be like, hey, like let's mine real Bitcoin. We're not going to do that. And who's going to join the NSA blockchain? And everyone just kind of laughs.
Yeah. I mean, it's true. That's an amazing feature of Bitcoin, and and I know I was saying like, let's not give blockchain too much credit, but that's one of the features of that is that you can fork, and you can have, the nice thing is you get the equal distribution too. So you can even hedge your bets. You say, oh, I'll keep my OFAC Bitcoin, but I'm also going to keep my non-OFAC Bitcoin, and you can kind of do what you want. But it's still dangerous though, because the forked Bitcoin can really be pummeled by the cultural aspect of everything. And, you might have to sacrifice a lot of value, which I think most of us would be willing to do. But it's just rough. So if we can confront that without having to do the fork, then that's all the better as far as I'm concerned. I know Bitcoiners like to say, kind of F you, we do what we want, and it's true to a degree. But there's nothing wrong with, playing a little preemptive defense and just getting out in front of this kind of stuff, because we know it's coming. And if we can get into the lobbying circles and get into the cultural circles and just convince them about the neutrality of money, that's the best case scenario. But you're right, and Andreas is obviously right. Forks will work just fine too.
Yeah. I guess you saw this. There was like a White House report maybe like a month ago that was kind of like analyzing the effects of proof of work. And there were like, some at some points in the report they were bashing it, and then at some points in the report they were like highlighting the benefits of proof of work, very clear benefits for the environment, for people, for communities, for jobs, for taxes. But there was like some debate in it. Do you think that proof of work, if it got bad on a federal level where they, maybe they weren't going to think about banning it, but they were like really pressuring and creating like very unnecessary or aggressive regulations, do you think it's possible that proof of work and maybe other, Bitcoin related topics will become more of like a states' rights issue, whereas like, currently there's a ton of miners in Kentucky. Blockware has, mines there. Texas, there's Riot Blockchain's massive facility and a bunch of other miners in Texas. Do you think if, the federal government comes down and tries to crack down on Bitcoin mining, will certain states that have a large presence in the industry, will they like fight back?
Yeah, I think that's one of the beauties of the way our country is set up, is that there is the capacity for that. And with Bitcoin in particular and proof of work, generally, it's primed for what you would refer to as jurisdictional arbitrage, where you jurisdiction shop, because these things, I just saw the Riot announcement today and I was like, that is a massive, massive warehouse. That might be difficult to kind of just up and move on a whim. But a lot of these miners, and I just was listening to Pierre Rochard, and he doesn't like the miner term, and I kind of agree with him too on that. But neither here, it's already kind of ingrained in my brain, so I'm going to stick with it. But a lot of these are capable of being picked up and moved relatively quickly. So I think you'll absolutely see jurisdictional arbitrage and states competing for either, I guess, political clout from among their constituents will say, oh, we want the miners out, and then also the political clout and monetary value of bringing miners in. So you're going to have that debate. I don't really see how federally or states-wise we ban proof of work itself. If you've had a chance to read, there's a lawyer, I think he's now the one of the lead counsel for, or general counsel for Crypto.com in North America. But his name's Justin Wales. He used to be just at a law firm, kind of like me. And he wrote a really good law review article on how Bitcoin proof of work is essentially, or Bitcoin is speech, and proof of work is part of that speech. And so you would run into First Amendment problems with banning the active proof of work, where if I'm a government and I'm trying to minimize proof of work, I think they'll probably have more success in banning particular uses of energy to do proof of work. I think you might have less First Amendment issues if you do it that way. But I don't really see like a proof of work ban really ever taking off in the United States, absent an extreme change in the Supreme Court, or a lot of precedent would have to be overturned, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. Like, we've seen the state of New York try to ban Bitcoin mining from like the exact point that you're bringing up, where it's like, hey, like, you can mine Bitcoin, but you can only do it from certain renewables. But I don't even think that ended up getting passed, or if it did, it's like multiple years out before it becomes reality. But yeah, I think like banning proof of work in the United States would be like a very far out thing, and it would be a big stretch, I think, especially as Bitcoin continues to grow and it gets more entrenched into the existing energy grids and just financial system.
Yeah, and there's kids being born right now will be the kids who were 5 years old are now 18 years old when Bitcoin was founded, right? So they're voters now, and they were 5 when Bitcoin was founded. As time goes on, you're going to have people alive who don't know a world without Bitcoin, and they're not. I don't think they're going to be interested in banning it. It's not going to be some crazy investment to them. It'll just be something that's been there the same way dollars were to us. We're like, well, when you're 20 years old, 15 years old, most people don't question dollars. Some do, but most people don't. So like, it's always been there and it's great. And now we're experiencing this moderately inflationary period, and people are starting to question, which I think is great. But there's some power in the history of a monetary medium. So when Bitcoin is just around for 20 or 30 years, people are just going to accept it as something that's useful, valuable, and is going to be there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like Blockware Intelligence does like a lot of reports on Bitcoin user adoption, and like you can use Glassnode data to like visually see that, hey, the amount of entities that are holding their own private keys on the Bitcoin blockchain is basically only going up. There's only going to be more and more people using this technology. And to me, it's like, if I'm using Bitcoin and by using, I mean just holding Bitcoin, I'm using it as savings technology. It's pretty valuable to me, right? Like that becomes one of the most important voting issues for me when politicians are running for election. Whereas if you're just, a regular person that doesn't own any Bitcoin, maybe you think proof of work is bad, that still might not necessarily, or likely won't be like your number one issue of like, hey, like we need to ban proof of work at all costs because I think it's like destroying the world. Whereas I definitely think there's probably that subset of people, but I think they're very small, like that really are willing to like put everything they have behind it. Whereas, if someone that has a large portion of their portfolio in Bitcoin, they're going to be very, aggressive to like, hey, like you're not banning proof of work. Like this is my money. This is my property. We're going to stop you right there.
Yeah, I agree. And you might get the single issue voter who's like, climate change is the only thing I care about. And if you're not on my side on that, then I'm not voting for you. But this also goes back to the educating the public and educating legislators and judges and things like that, is that Bitcoin really is not a net negative on climate by any measurement, right? I mean, CO2, if that's your boogeyman, even though it is very, it's a natural, I hate that people are trying to classify it as a pollutant, but, it's really not a net negative on that. It's fantastic for monetizing and potentially bringing into profit otherwise unprofitable renewable energy grids. So if you're solar, and you have no demand, it's a no-brainer to have a Bitcoin miner out there ready to suck up that no demand solar period. You're not going to store it; it's going to dissipate. That's an absolute no-brainer. So if we can, whether or not you agree with the climate change angle on promoting Bitcoin by saying, hey, we can help climate change, sometimes people don't want to accept that argument. I get that. Like maybe it's not worth entertaining, but to the extent that you feel that, we can assuage some of their fears, unless they're just absolutely unwilling to listen to, reason, then you can have some converts, I think, on that. And I think that's good. And again, it makes your battle down the road a little bit easier. And I don't think if we're trying to separate money from state in a way that hasn't been accomplished in a long time. I mean, the money has always been gravitating towards state throughout human history. And now we're trying to take that and change that path and get it away from state. And it's an incredibly difficult task. So if there's a way that we can make that easier, then we should pursue it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think it's, such an interesting topic to talk about. I'll ask you one more question and then we'll just go ahead and wrap this up. So what do you think, and you can take this however you want, from a legal perspective or just from a Bitcoin focused perspective, whatever you want. What do you think the future looks like in 30 years and what role does Bitcoin play?
So I'll take it from the Bitcoin perspective, because I am as I said, I'm 100% convinced that this thing is the real deal and it's our best shot at, getting away from a lot of the incentive mechanisms that have brought us to this point where we have so little faith in our traditional institutions that require faith to operate. So whether it's media, I mean, even now we have healthcare. Healthcare has come in the last 3 years. The healthcare apparatus has really come into question. Whether it's government between the Congress and the legislatures or judges and everything that requires trust or that used to have trust is really has been deteriorated over time. And I think that's a result of the perverse incentive mechanisms of fiat money, where you're able to essentially take from those around you without asking them through inflation, and then you can, on the other hand, take that you've just stolen from them, subsidize things that they didn't vote for or ask for, and that's mostly what's going on. So if we can pull back to a situation where Bitcoin is, I don't know, it doesn't even have to be ubiquitous, just well accepted and common, that will disincentivize that behavior, because the monetary system will be linked, at least in some degree, to something real, in the same way that it was under gold. But we've seen gold fail for obvious reasons. Like it's centralizing. It has naturally centralizing features, and I think everything does to a degree. But gold failed, and it's not going to unfail. You're not going to get a situation where gold becomes easier to transport in a digital economy of the next 30 years, 20, 30 years. It's not going to become less cumbersome to use gold in your life, or less centralized, or less reliant on other intermediaries to do the changing of hands. So Bitcoin's really the best shot. It's native, it's digitally native, it's a strong, sound money, and I'd love to see it get a strong amount of adoption, and also replace some of those trust mechanisms that we used to have. You have countries that mutually don't trust each other. The one thing you need is an economic ledger that doesn't require trust, and I think that's the void that Bitcoin is going to hold. I think you'll see your large national transactions settled on chain L1 Bitcoin periodically. You'll have a greater adoption, whether it's L2, L3 adoption, whether it's Lightning or something else. Although Lightning's doing really well right now, and that will be your big trust. The ability to get trust back into the ecosystem and in what has been completely degrading over the last 50 or 60 years. So that's my hope. That's hyper Bitcoinization for me. It's not using Bitcoin for necessarily every transaction. I think you'll still have currencies here and there, but it's getting that for those large transactions that can take place between mutually distrusting parties on a trustworthy ledger that you don't need to independently verify yourself, or that you do independently verify yourself.
Nice. Yeah, I like it. I think this is a great conversation. I think the audience will love it because you offer like a unique, perspective from a certain like a legal practice that, a lot of people on Bitcoin Twitter or in the crypto world may not be too familiar with. So I think this is great. Do you have anything you want to plug, like your Twitter, your law practice, or a website or anything?
Yeah, definitely always take the opportunity to plug. Now my Twitter is just Bryan Jacoutot, Bryan Jacoutot. It's my name up there. But if y'all are a Bitcoin focused company and you guys need legal work, whether it's structuring your company, whether it's litigation, really, we run the whole gambit. So if you need any help, just give me a shout. I'm happy to help, and I'm certainly down with the cause.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.